Fontaine, the nation of baguettes. There's a bunch of water, a bunch of cool buildings, and a lot of laws. Today I'd like to cover not just why it's good, but specifically how it's a good comeback. It's phenomenal even, and I want to discuss that. When talking about its role as a comeback, I'll be discussing what it takes from previous nations, as it has the environment of Inazuma, charm of the early nations, and quantity of Sumeru. I'll also be discussing how it's different for the better, and overall just why it's a phenomenal comeback. That entails nostalgia too, as nostalgia is the heart of linking things together over time. It's possible I'll make a follow-up video to this next year since the nation isn't exactly finished, and I just wanted to cover it since the main story is done. I'll talk about the environment, then the gameplay, followed by the characters and story, and if anything's left after all of that, it'll be brought up in an extra segment afterwards. A lot of commentary on its ability to balance things and different elements will be touched upon as well. So like, join, subscribe, and let's get into this spoiler-filled deep dive of a video.
So it's time for something truly extraordinary, don't you think? This one's a little tricky.
Fontaine has a very unique but familiar environment, though I'll get into the unique and fresh content later on in this section. For now, know that the land terrain is somewhat like a more modern and blue variation of Mondstadt's terrain. It has a significant tone of emotional value through this blue motif, and it sticks with the water I mentioned and accents on the many buildings found throughout. It's a little dark, but not in the same way as Inazuma. It's less tragic and more hard-hitting. It's got feels to it when it's raining, and the constant streams of water paired with the soundtracks prove this. It's got the emotion of Inazuma without the hostility, is what I'm saying. It's probably the most themed around its element when compared to other nations, which is clear with places like the kinetic engineering region. Big blocks of mostly water consisting terrain float throughout the place, all a pure shade of blue maintaining that Fontaine feel to it. Alongside this, the court of Fontaine and most surface level buildings are all white, helping give the daytime a cheery feel while making nighttime and rainy weather feel more miserable or emotional, as the shift to a grey tone is easy to see with the colour white, and grey itself can easily be associated with grey morality, a common denominator in most arcs within the Fontaine story. Before I continue, I was listening to the Fontaine soundtrack while writing this, and there's a lot of digestive sounds that keep being used within the tracks. Following the torrent shows this well with the bell sound, and keep in mind, it's not exclusive to this track. However, when digestive sounds aren't present, it feels far more peaceful, organic and genuine, much like other nations. Hoyomix seems to use this contrast effectively to create different atmospheres with the music. Long notes are used often within primarily the battle themes, giving the nation that dramatic edge that is associated with thematics and plays. Now, I want to move into a completely different place, the Fortress of Meropide.
The Fortress of Meropide may seem like a prison, but it should in fact be regarded as a gathering place for exiles. I will arrange false charges against you so that you may secretly investigate inside the fortress. On the color wheel, orange to brownish coloring is the opposite to the various shades of blue, solidifying for me that this place is meant to subvert the classical beauty and emotion of the general nation. The fortress utilizes electric guitars and more instruments that aren't present within the surface soundtrack. However, they both have classical, mechanical songs to them, just to two different extremes within the same style. This is true for the map itself, being technically advanced much like the courts and cities of Fontaine, yet for totally different reasoning, and it's achieved differently as well. It gives a contrast to the nation, much like how the nation gives contrast to morality. This nation is all about contrast as well, and that's why it's a good comeback. It does a far better job at the integral world building and environment linking back to the themes of the story when compared to any other region, maybe besides Inazuma, but it's very basic there. Fontaine is integrally designed for this purpose, and it's why it's such a phenomenal comeback, as I said. The relationship of Inazuma, the variety of Sumeru and more. However, you may be wondering why I haven't discussed the underwater regions yet. Well, here we go.
What could it be?
After being away from the sunlight for so long, even the terrifying depths of the sea start to feel like home.
I have to...
Much like how the fortress and various colour palettes of the nation have convinced me this place is a metaphor for its themes, the underwater parts do too. You can't do this elsewhere, and it's diving into a whole new world, like you're diving into your own morality. Deep, dark caves hide in corners of the larger water bodies like the dark corners of your mind, yet plenty of places are a paradise to explore too. This is more personal to Fontaine in comparison to the fortress, as it shares the same colours, simply being more intense and even more Fontainian than the surface itself. However, a big part of its comeback vibe is its return to basics despite its later release date. It shares a lot of connections with Mondstadt, which I made a video on, and of course, Mondstadt is the beginning of your journey. Making that stuff return gives a sense to look back on your journey, therefore giving it that ability to be a good comeback in the end. The white court looking like Mondstadt's cathedral, the organised city, or the green hillish nature of the place. There's also yellow patches of ground in newer areas of the nation too, which I felt like mentioning. It shows those dark places or even inconsistent places on the surface instead of underwater. All of this makes the place phenomenal, let alone a great comeback after the slightly controversial Sumeru. It's my favourite nation personally. They utilise layered caverns far better here as well than they did back then, as there's less of them and the existing ones are larger and easy to get access to, though I think that is it for the environment. Colour is great to analyse, and it's clear that this place is phenomenal, especially in improving old tropes from the other nations. A quick recap is the amazing balance of colour tones to represent morality, punishment, the long notes frequently used in soundtracks for emotional value that sticks, blue, relevance to the elemented nation, and more. Time to move on to the gameplay, people.
Is this what justice means to you? Answer me, Neuvillette!
You will see much in the human world, from the delightful to the depressing. And one day, when you have dwelt among humanity long enough, you will be placed to bring judgment over all as a spokesperson for Fontaine's past.
It is unnecessary to hold me in such high regard.
Fontaine's mechanics are heavily influenced by the environment, and vice versa, the underwater being a good example. I already mentioned how well they blended the environment and storyline, but it's time to see where the gameplay falls into this pyramid and how it makes Fontaine such a phenomenal comeback. The primary gameplay point is swimming underwater, having a surprisingly fun alternative to the surface level exploration. However, it lacks progression, which is a problem when compared to that aforementioned surface contrast. That's irrelevant though. The underwater content is inherently temporary due to its exclusivity, after all, though this does show the incredible blending between the two dimensions as the environment actively links with the gameplay through the animals who grant you abilities alongside the tangled seagrass, blowy blowholes, big mysterious balls and more. There's a whole array of new puzzles here and a bunch more above the water. For a moment though, I'd like to mention, how do I pronounce this? Penuma and Osea, as it highlights the contrast I mentioned earlier between the fortress of Meropide and General Fontaine. It literally shows yellow and blue alongside it being man-made energies, much like the man-made nature of the fortress. It's like yin yang bro, showing anarchy and hierarchy together as two separate energies, sorta. I don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, above the water, a bunch of mechanical stuff awaits, much like the underwater region. The mechanics are made by people, and therefore represents, to some level, the morality of those people. Plenty of elevators and stuff immerse the player within the mechanical, fresh and unique environment exclusive to the nation. There's a sense of slight time ticking or urgency as well with the prophecy, shown in soundtracks like Shade of Flowers. It's melancholy as it's supposed to be the death of all Fontainians, and it's inevitable within a matter of time. Clocks themselves are also mechanical in the same way other mechanisms throughout the nation are, which I think is an interesting little thing that came to my mind. The mechanics themselves are also relatively simple, and while not as much as Sumeru, they're good, and perhaps that slight edge of complexity is a good thing. It adds a bit more thought than just mindlessly shooting things with Dendro, though I don't know, I like being mindless. However, the amount of different things is good. A main reason there is such a vast collection of puzzles and challenges is mainly due to the underwater, and that's cool. Since you're so far into the game, it's only right to have so many different forms of content to consume, and it's clear people like it as everybody in the co-op games I join have extremely high exploration percentages in Fontaine. In Sumeru there wasn't much variety in both the halves of the place, though this can be good to some as it shows consistency across gameplay. However, Fontaine manages to be consistent and fun simultaneously, as every puzzle has other types and alternations linked to them. Whether it be annoying constantly applied hydro devices, water platforms, or taking the soul from innocent sea animals. Fontaine is good as a comeback. It's nostalgic with the fresh gameplay as well, going back to the underwater, as it's solely just a new thing to do. It's unmatched, being a complete balanced alternative to the surface. When I say most of Fontaine is underwater, I mean it. They blend underground caves with the water tunnels as well, showing that blending I love so much that's been done perfectly throughout the place. This nation isn't a chore, overwhelming, or anything of the sort. Ironically, it's the opposite. It's free. When you connect with Hydro and dive underwater, you can go anywhere you'd like, really. Up, down, sideways, through tunnels, through strong currents, and just so many places. The amount of underwater teleporters is crazy too, and the fact you hardly need to earn any boosts or power down, there is another reason it's so freeing. However, the surface is more restricting as it's so filled with laws, showing a sense of irony. The more human, controlled aspects of the land are less free, and it creates a struggle of morality between the two sides, once again like Pneuma and Osea. Furina can go from freely walking on water to having to swim through it in a matter of seconds, due to these energies. Creating a literal example, Fontaine is an everlasting balance, and it's why it's a phenomenal comeback. It's Mondstadt if the freedom was balanced with restricting in an appealing way where you can choose. Improving upon the first nation while playing by its rules, much like the environment, creates that feeling of it being a comeback once again. It manages to bring everything the game's developed since 2020 and make it balanced, fun, and refreshing. It's a paradise like Mondstadt, refreshing like Liyue, an anomalous emotional wreck at times like Inazuma, and rich with content like Sumeru. Will future nations engage in the balancing act too? Perhaps Natlan will focus on subverting Fontaine since it's so well made. A summary of this is all three dimensions of content link. The clear metaphors for morality and justice found throughout the mechanics, the variety yet consistency and perfect balance and challenge in these mechanics, the themes around hydro and mechanical soundtracks with ticking time and melancholy, and the themes of freedom and restriction. Now we can move to the story, characters, and a bit of lore mixed in as well. Fontaine is a heartfelt story with a variety of expanded upon parts of the lore, characters, and more, so let's get into it. I'll kick off by pushing that balancing act theory a bit more, but reminding you of Furina once again. The character herself not only has an interior versus exterior thing going on for the first 4 acts, but in the 5th, reveals she is literally only half of the bigger picture. They were both restricted to an extent, but Focalors avoided the responsibility of an Archon whilst Furina was given it. Anyway, this story has parts focused on the Fatui and the House of the Hearth, showing a morally ambiguous Arlecchino fitting with the nation of Fontaine.
Though it could officially be considered a diplomatic conference, I prefer to see our meeting today as an ordinary tea party. I assume you see it the same way, Miss Furina?
It matches with environment and gameplay both, going to show how well they all mix together. I'm struggling to avoid touching on other sections in each, to be completely honest with you. However, this moral ambiguity creates interest and curiosity as she does seemingly unexpected things and goes to hook the player for places such as Snezhnaya. Lyney, Lynette, and Freminet all show a new part of the Fatui besides that as well, being the first playable non-harbingers that are still linked to the organisation. I love Collegianus Hearthfire, however you pronounce that. Banger soundtrack. They themselves are also linked to the morality of the place, showing that some in the Fatui aren't exactly linked with the organisation on an emotional moral level. They do their job and are there for their benefits, which while true to a lot of the Harbingers, especially Arlecchino appropriately enough, it isn't on the level of them. It's very interesting how the outside Fatui are the ones doing a lot to help the nation, while the Archon herself isn't doing nearly as much. It's a subversive dynamic to teach the player about both Fontaine's allegiance in the world alongside the Fatuis, and I think it'll pop back up later. Genshin was a little irrelevant for a while, but these cool things I'm hoping brought back a chunk of the player base. Don't forget Neuvillette, the first dragon sovereign to be a playable, seemingly human character. They're really throwing all the cards in the ring for this nation, especially with how he becomes effectively the Archon at the end of the story. This also adds more information on visions as well, and there's a literal intergalactic narwhal, and we learned that the Gnosis are made from the third Descender. I don't know if I like the cinematics of the finale at point, just because of its length, but holy crap there are some lore drops. Childe comes back too, and unlike with Scaramouche and Sumeru, there were 2 nations between his first and second appearances, increasing the impact of his return. A lot of impact is thrown in parts of Fontaine, yet balanced with a lot of relaxed, deeper and more psychological scenes and concepts. They know how to balance it to a point where more normal scenes helps emphasize the important ones to a consistent extent. The ratio of filler and build to climax is significantly better than other nations, if you exclude the Fortress of Meropide. The only thing keeping this nation from being a perfect comeback is the fact that Acts 3 and 4, though primarily 3, are primarily filler. That was a lot of primarily. The reason Act 4 is lesser so is due to the Arlecchino, but outside of her relevance to the Fatui and Na'vi in Act 5, she's kind of insignificant to the overall story. It shows a second side to Fontaine, yes, as despite justice bringing the goodwill and rule followers higher, it punishes the rule breakers significantly more, but that positive is only really there for the environment and some parts of the story, primarily being the fact that the Traveler is at his lowest in the fortress, having next to nothing. There's other stuff this nation did well, such as not leaving any characters behind, as the Fatui siblings and even Sigewinne have relevance past their debuts, and that's something never done in a nation's story. Typically, the first characters introduced in a story are also the first to make their exit, yet this isn't true for Lyney, Lynette and Freminet. Other characters like Childe, Lisa, Ayaka, and more may return in the finale for a brief moment, but that's only to help make the story feel more finished and concluded. These three return in all acts going from 3 to 5. I'd say Wriothesley is the closest to this happening, as he's more like a spectator in Acts 3 and parts of 4, and only has a single scene in 5. Despite this, it's still a phenomenal comeback. Court trials are cool too. To summarise this all, it's phenomenal especially as a comeback due to their clear attempts to take and improve from Mondstadt. It's care for the characters, link between the 3 dimensions of content, and it brings everything together to expand and introduce a boatload of content, more than any nation before it. Fontaine is well made, the thought put into everything is nothing short of admirable, and the execution of that thought is phenomenal in itself. It's phenomenal, a phenomenal comeback. Like, join, subscribe, and thanks for watching.